will now
answer them at the end if we have time. First up is the Americans with Disabilities Act National Network KT Center at the University of Washington. Joining us to talk about this center is Kurt Johnson, director of the center, and Mark Harniss, co-investigator at the center. So it's over to you, Kurt and Mark.
Okay, thank you, John, and we're delighted to be here. I'd like to begin by just noting that we have a lot of what I'm describing you can see on our website, which is adakt.org, adata.org. We have focused on developing KT materials that can be used, hopefully, to improve the implementation of ADA in the community. And that includes a number of new fact sheets that we've developed, including ones on accessible healthcare, medical diagnostic equipment, work leave, the employment of veterans, and others. And we do these in a way that where we try to ensure that they're actually accessible from an instructional design perspective to potential constituents. So we actually test them out on people that we think might use it, ask them to go through a process of talking out loud about them, so we know whether or not they're understanding what we say in the way in which we hope they will. We've put a lot of effort into maintaining, reviewing, and updating existing materials. And one example is that we have a booklet on service animals and emotional support animals, which has been very popular. And I think because of the variations in state and federal laws and even local laws and the confusion over the rights and roles people have related to service animals. We have an ongoing effort to translate materials into Spanish. We've done 11 in the last half of the year. Because our website is one of the primary vehicles for our KT, we put quite a bit of effort into maintaining and updating the website with a focus on new ways to make it easier for users to find important information. We've added trending topics and a section on new fact sheets on the home page. And also added content on the 25th ADA anniversary that's coming up next year. We've used the same principles of evaluating the usability of our website that we do in our fact sheets and having key constituents work their way through it and talk to us about it. And in fact, I was just doing that with Mark before we signed on, where I said, where the heck are these things? Because I didn't see them right away. So website usage, we've been getting 376,888 unique visitors this last year, with 668,220 web pages accessed. Another primary goal we've had is in measuring outcomes, and this is an important part of KT. We've ongoing maintenance of our outcomes measurement system, which we designed to capture the outputs of all the information nationwide from our 10 regional centers to make sure that it's user-friendly and easy to access. And we've implemented a quarterly reporting system for all the regional directors and NIDRR project officers so that everyone can see the TA and training and public awareness activities of the network. But we're also implementing a system for actually measuring outcomes rather than outputs, as the outcomes that are a result of technical assistance provided by the network. And I described this to you last year. It involves calling recipients of TA technical assistance at 3 and 6 months to find out whether they perceive that there are any measurable changes in implementation of ADA that occurred, that is associated with the technical assistance provided by the ADA network. It's complicated to describe outcomes and to measure them, particularly when outcomes are complex. So we've developed another process where we essentially are creating case studies by outcomes, because outcomes in terms of ADA implementation are complex. They develop over time. They may develop, someone may attend a training, and then they may contact the ADA Center and ask for technical assistance, and then they may come back for more technical assistance. And many of the, well, I think all of the ADA network sites are really intimately intertwined with their local communities, and we wanted a way to capture that. So we've developed an initiative about writing success stories where in a journalistic style with interviews with key players that were involved both in the community as recipients of TA or who were associated with technical assistance, and with the ADA network staff who were involved. The other thing that we've done is to develop a set of regional profiles that highlight the unique contributions each regional center has made to the broader network, and compile these into a national profile. And this is again a way to try and capture some of the very complex outcomes that we know are occurring as a result of the activities of the ADA National Network. The last thing I wanted to talk about was that John had asked that we discuss was whether we had any ideas for supporting implementation of KT plans. And I think we all recognize that it's particularly difficult because many of us, and I'm thinking of other NIDRR grants we have, were not asked to include KT in our proposals, but we did, and we know that it's a critical part of what we do. So often we don't have the funding that's necessary to do an extensive KT work. So then the trick from our perspective is to figure out how to wrap KT into everyday activities that we do. And I think because many of us have proceeded from a participatory action model, KT is implicit in most of what we do. We are, I think, strong proponents increasingly of translating what we do into plain language, about making that accessible and useful to people who may be able to use it, even if it's on a small scale effort. And we think that we have fairly good anecdotal data, at least, that people use these consumer-friendly, plain language kinds of materials, and they may use them in ways that improve their access to their healthcare service or legal issues, or in the case of the ADA-KT work. And with that, I think I'll conclude. And I am going to, I have 100 and some graduate students waiting for me to do a 2-hour lecture on disability civil rights, and so Harniss will be here for the Q&A on our behalf. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Kurt. We'll go ahead and move ahead. Our next presentation is by Kathleen Murphy, and you've been hearing her voice today already. She also serves as Research Director on the Center on Knowledge Translation for Employment Research, or CATER, here at CETL. So as our colleague, I'm happy to turn it over to you again, Kathleen.
Okay, well, hello again, everybody. Yes, I'm wearing a slightly different hat for the next 10 minutes as representing our CATER Center. So I'm not going to talk about everything that the CATER Center does. I tried just to pull things that are relevant to media. They do, though, touch on different aspects of our scope. So I'm going to tell you first a little bit about our research, and then a little bit about some media-oriented training, and then some resources, and then tell you how to keep in touch with us. So we do have 2 studies here that are housed at CETL. One is, I mentioned this earlier, when Josie Bisek was talking about how important relationships were to her when she was trying to make connections with experts or researchers that might give her stories or help her vet her stories. So we actually tested that strategy in the sense of using what we called a champion. It wasn't just our term, but it's a term in the literature, and thinking through, well, what kind of like a liaison, who would help us in getting a request for an endorsement for a webinar that we were doing. And we approached organizations in disability and employment domain. In fact, one of them was the KT ADA Center. I highlight it here because I think, as it has turned out, that the findings might be relevant to designing outreach to media, so how important those networks are. Another strategy we're testing, and this is with an HR, a human resource, supervisor employer-oriented audience, is using a webinar. We're approaching supervisors and asking them to do the webinar that we had up for the endorsement for in the other kind of related study in the use of a champion, and teaching them about cancer and employment issues. So I can't really go into too much detail here, but there's different ways that we present the webinar and the follow-up. So the findings will be relevant to thinking through the intensity of media outreach. Is it enough just to do a webinar, or are there other ways that you need to package that or follow up after you have just that didactic presentation? We are actually still recruiting for that study, so I'm going to put in a little plug. If any of you are supervisors, or if you know supervisors who might be interested in learning more about how to manage their employees with cancer, they can go to either of those URLs. I thought the tiny URL is a little bit easier to remember, the /cancer training, and sign up to take our webinar, and we will share our findings with you and all of our participants. CATER has a partner, and it's researchers at Virginia Commonwealth University. And those of you who were here on Wednesday, Catherine Inge talked about their study of the use of Facebook as a way of getting research out to a particular audience. In this case, it's survivors of traumatic brain injury, and they're focused on getting the content related to supported employment. So these findings are going to be relevant to the use of social media, perhaps among other consumer groups that experience similar functional limitations. VCU is also putting out information about supported employment to VR counselors, and they're comparing online modules versus fact sheets. So again, similar to our webinar study, it's thinking through not just intensity, but a lot of literature on KT shows that you really need to do multiple kinds of contacts in multiple ways, similar to the multi-channel discussions of social media we've been talking about, that just one mode is probably not going to be enough to get to those outcomes that Kurt was talking about. So those are our 4 research tests, our research-based tests of KT strategies. We also do training. So we did a training, a face-to-face workshop in April on the effective use of social media, and the topics included strategies for creating accessible social media tools and measuring the impact of social media, so really getting into those analytics or figuring out which particular channel might be good for a particular kind of goal that you have or audience. And we heard from Hope Adler, Katya Albanese, and Mike Reardon from ePolicyWorks, as well as Katie Payne from Payne Publishing. And again, that is online at that link there. You can still register for that and access the archive of that event. Just last month, we had a conference similar to this one, an online conference, and the archive is there at that URL, cater.org/conference/index.html. And we did do some presentations relevant to the research that I just described. So if you look for these 3 presentations, you can hear more about those studies. The use of a champion as a KT strategy with a policymaker audience, was on the September 16th session. Policymaking 2.0, using new technologies to inform disability employment policy, and that was ePolicyWorks again. And then Catherine Inge talked a little bit about some of the preliminary findings they have from their CATER Consumer Research Report. That's the Facebook study. Okay, so that's training, and then we have resources, because We obviously at the Knowledge Translation for Employment Research Center are trying to promote the use of research in doing our dissemination. Also, there is research about KT strategies, as I've been describing, and that's not unique or new to the Cater Center. So our KT strategies database has lots of studies about the efficacy of different kinds of strategies. So if you're thinking through about what kinds of outreach should I be doing to what audiences, this is a great resource for you. And it's a joint project between the Cater Center and KTDRR, the sponsor of this week's conference. And so you can learn more at that URL about our KT strategies database. We also, with our partner BCU, have another database of articles on disability and employment research. So you can go there, search using the setup that they have there, the search engine, to find the kinds of research that you might need, maybe to tie in to something anecdotal that you've done, or to help with your grant writing. It's there for you. Now, if you need any help at all in thinking through some of the things that you've learned at this conference, or in using these resources, or in accessing these trainings, the Cater does provide technical assistance to NIDRR and RSA grantees. RSA is the Rehabilitation Services Agency, for those of you who are joining us from outside of the U.S. And we do, if you get in touch with Cater, we focus on employment-oriented researchers. So if you're coming from some of the other domains or priority areas at NIDRR, that NIDRR funds, we would refer you to our KTDRR staff. So you can get in touch either through our forum there, or call the same 1-800 number that is being staffed today by Tracy Bauman. We do also, as you know, at CEDL's Disability Research Practice to Program, we're all about social media, so Cater is no exception. We have our Facebook page at /cater.org, and you can tweet at /Cater_Center. And that is what I have to say so far about the Cater Center.
Okay, thank you very much, Kathleen. Next up is Shannon Patridge, who is Research Assistant and Social Media Coordinator at the Center for International Rehabilitation Research Information Exchange, or commonly referred to as CIRI, at the University of Buffalo. So now I'll turn it over to you, Shannon.
Thank you. Yes, hi, I am Shannon Patridge. Okay, can everybody hear me? Great. All right. Yes, so I'm with the Center for International Rehabilitation Research and Information Exchange, as he said, is CIRI. We are another NIDRR grantee. We work through the University at Buffalo Research Foundation. Surely you're familiar with our resources. We have a database of research articles, which is really highly curated. We have a whole database for you to research. We also produce the topical bibliographies on topics such as stroke, diabetes, and cultural competency monographs, which you can also find online as well as in print. Now, when we started our social media outreach campaign, it wasn't really formally launched. I came on board about a year and a half ago, and it was probably only just this past spring that I've really been able to put a concerted effort into our social media efforts. And I have to say I am glad that I have done so, because already we're seeing results. So I think the overall arc of my presentation is that if you build it, they will come, because we've been building it, and slowly but surely we are seeing results. My original plan was to get as much effectiveness out as I could out of my time. As I mentioned, I am a research assistant, primarily social media coordinator secondarily. I've only been able to allocate a few hours a week to social media, so I try to get the most out of that time that I can. So I wanted to go in with a good plan. So I wanted to have goals, and I think the goals sort of work in tiers. Obviously, I want to send messages that reach users, eventually build a following, have stakeholders come to our social media platforms regularly because they get value out of them. And then from that, we would hope that they would develop good impressions of us. And, whether you want to use the word brand or not. Actually, Josie mentioned the word brand earlier, and I'm glad she did. A lot of the things that you'll read about social media will mention your brand, and granted that working in our sorts of fields that we do, we're not flashy, we're not selling energy drinks, so anything you read about a brand might not feel like it applies to you, but in a way it does, because people are still creating associations with who you are. So we want those associations to be accurate and positive. From that, we would like to foster increased use. Sorry if this is a bit redundant from all the information we've heard before, but I guess repetition is good. So the social platforms that we have available are pretty much the basics. Now when I was planning, you have to list all your resources, including the free platforms as well as yourself, your time, your expertise. We have our Twitter feed, we have a Facebook page, and then we also have our LinkedIn presence, and that is where I spend the majority of my time. Our Twitter feed has been getting a lot more response lately because of the time that we've put into it. Our Facebook page, I do hope to expand more. I got a lot out of the breakout groups yesterday, and what I hope to do more with, I would like to hear more about LinkedIn. LinkedIn is another social group. It's another social media networking site that is focused primarily for professional activities. So maybe if people are reluctant to post about their work activity and they don't want to get it crossed with their personal Facebook things, maybe if you wanted to start on LinkedIn, that might help you individually sort of compartmentalize your professional social life from your personal one. Although I am hearing more that it is more acceptable to be professional and be personal on Facebook. We are all real people, careers and hobbies. And that does speak back to the conversation about having your own voice when you post. Even when you do post as your company, you still do have some sort of voice. I like to sort of cultivate what I call approachable, friendly, but informed. And that's just kind of the mindset I get into when I'm writing. I want to be clear in my writing and direct, not overly wordy, which can be difficult when you're so used to reading long tracts of information all day, to sit down yourself and produce something that's just snappy. So what I try to do is when I post content, I try to think like our stakeholders. I try to imagine who uses Siri, and when they're on Facebook, what is it that would just pull them in? I like to look at, for sources of content to share, I try to keep salient with the news. So in the time that I've been really building up our social media plan, I've started a bookmark full of news sources that I scan through periodically. I try to make time at least, once a week to read up on all those articles. And now I'm not here every day. I'm only here Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So what I need to do is schedule my posts. And that helps me have content up when I'm not here. I don't have to think about it when I'm home. Now, they say, they being the social media experts, when I read up about best practices, they say that your content should offer something. It shouldn't just be blah, we have such and such a thing. like these are our products. You want it to have a takeaway, and that should be that it is either entertaining, informative, or visually stunning. I thought maybe entertaining isn't exactly a third of the content that I want to post, so in my thinking of what kinds of content I want to find, I came up with the tweak of that: useful, interesting, inspiring. And I think it's the inspiring posts that seem to generate more interaction, those sort of feel-good posts. Although who doesn't like a useful tool to be presented to them? I think people appreciate that with time. So the scheduling posts, as I said, is very important, and I use Hootsuite for that. I use tags. Now, one thing that is important, if you use Hootsuite, I learned that LinkedIn doesn't have the tag functionality. So if I want to post the same link to Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn, I'll use one composition drop-down for Twitter and Facebook because they allow tags, hashtags, and then I'll put the same message in another composition window for LinkedIn because the tags would look silly, not having any function. So Hootsuite lets me know that scheduling my posts in advance helps me feel confident that when I'm off, that the Siri social machine is still running. When I first started running our social media platforms, I was just doing my best to get to it when I could, and I thought I was doing a good job. The University at Buffalo did some workshops, and they really suggested, even if you're not working with anybody else, you need an editorial calendar to keep yourself on task. And I have to say they were right. I started an editorial calendar, which is just a Google document that I made a spreadsheet, and it just keeps me on task. It's almost like a to-do sheet. And I don't write it with the purpose of sharing it, but if I needed to, I could. So when well, I guess I kind of covered these points, but I just try to make sure that the calendar works for me. If I worried about who was looking at it, I think I would spend more time futzing with the calendar than actually worrying about my content. I do pop on Twitter on my days off just to see what else is going on. I sort of can't resist because Twitter is very social. I want to see what people are posting. It moves so quickly. So that's another step, is to be social, is not just to post, but to see the other real users that are actually using this, and to make sure you follow up on comments, and just get out there and actually use it. That's all there is to say, is just be your brand and use it. And once you've put some content out there, then you'll get some feedback. The internet gives us all kinds of awesome tools. We can quantify our usage, and from that you can look back, see what posts were popular, see what they have in common, learn what's working, and adapt your strategy from there. I am just at that point now where I've been doing the social media on a strict schedule since for a few months now, so I'm really excited to see what trends are going to come out of that. Facebook Analytics has some great tools. They show the interaction data. Now this works on a page, not a profile. I don't want to run long here, but the tools have been enormously helpful, and the Hootsuite reports, they come to me automatically, and they track your hourly links. I can get them automatically emailed. Now the free account does have limited functionality. I've used the paid Hootsuite account before, and I would recommend that if that's in your budget. If you're able to purchase media services, I think it's $6 a month. You can add team members and have lots of great reports. I would suggest that. Oh, there's my Hootsuite graphic. You can see Twitter followage is up for the most part. I actually wish I could update the graphic for today because it looks more positive. That's what I've got. That is what's working for us at Siri. So I would invite you to bookmark Siri for your own research. Follow us on Twitter. And if anybody wants to continue the conversation about social media, you can find me on LinkedIn. It's Shannon Patridge, not Partridge. Apologies for running over.
No, you did very, very well, Shannon.
Okay.
got a little extra time here so we could raise a few questions with you
Oh,
three
sure.
folks that have been talking, and Mark taking the place of Kurt. Amy sent in a question via Twitter, so, you know, we pay special attention to Twitter questions. And it is, do any NIDRR grantees, and I guess we could translate that to be NIDRR grantees and or centers with Facebook pages, use boosts or paid promotions?
You know, I haven't used them for Siri, but I've done some consulting work where it was an arts group that I was the social media consultant for. We spent just a small amount of money, $30 a month or so, on the Facebook posts, and I think it was worth it.
So I guess Mark or Kathleen, do you know about boosts and paid promotions, Facebook? Do you use them?
I'm aware of them, but we have not used them yet.
Yeah, there's,
You know, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, this is Kathleen. When we were promoting the Cancer and Employment webinar, we talked about doing something like that, or in purchasing a way to use Google so that our search would come up more prominently, but we didn't end up implementing that, although it's not a discussion we've completely tabled either.
I think if you compare it to the cost of print media, you know, maybe spending money on the internet just seems funny to some people. If you compare it to the cost of a box of business cards, a few of these ads probably would pay for themselves. Well, being that most of us are nonprofits, it's hard to think of it as like, oh, spend money to make money. We're not making money, we're making progress, right?
I like that.
Yeah. I personally wouldn't pay an SEO specialist. I would try to just hire content writers that sort of had a natural ability to write keyword-rich material. If you're posting a quantity of content that is rich in good content, I mean, it will be keyword-rich by its own nature, and it'll come up in search engines. I think there's a balance between I'm going to lay a lot more groundwork for free with the free tools, like the free Hootsuite. Well, maybe I think the Pro Hootsuite actually would be pretty handy. But I sort of make the analogy of it's like basketball sneakers. Like if I bought a pair of Air Jordans, I couldn't dunk. But if I were so good at basketball that I just needed to be a quarter ounce lighter, then I would go for it. So I think that's how I think. You do the groundwork that you can with what you have, and then spend a little when you're ready and you would really benefit from it.
Another thing we did with Cater was on LinkedIn, which it was free, but we joined some groups that we thought would have conversational threads relevant to the cancer and employment topic, and waited until someone said something where we could say, oh, great point, by the way, you may be interested in, you know, our training, here's the link. I don't think we got a ton of registrants out of it, but as I think people know with marketing, you have to really do multi-pronged efforts, so it was one thing that we got some success out of.
I think it's important not to get discouraged if your first 20 posts are only seen by 8 people. You just have to build on it. The time is going to pass anyway. So I say just keep building it.
Sure, and you can think about it exponentially. You know, I told friends and I told people.
That's what I was telling myself the other day when I was looking at our LinkedIn activity. It was less than I'd hoped for. I'm really anxious for the day that I make a post to a group and it gets blasted to the email of the people that follow that group. That seems like a LinkedIn achievement. But the groups to me seem like I'm finding a lot of groups where people are just posting and there isn't a lot of conversation. So I hope that soon people will be more willing to really genuinely engage on LinkedIn, because I feel like sometimes there's a lot of just shouting of professionalisms. So hopefully people do engage more, at least this is all obviously in my experience.
I think that's a good point. I think sometimes, particularly like in social media, we tend to think the numbers are low, but I can just say I spent last weekend with a group of university researchers, and they were talking about, of course, their delight in terms of journal articles, and that actually when there are assessments of how many people read individual articles within a journal, if you can indeed get to a journal, those numbers are exceedingly low. It's not atypical for them to be less than 10 for a long periods of time. So when we think our social media numbers are low, it's all relative. I'll just say that. I think to clarify, one of the things Mark talked about was KT planning, and that we didn't have KT plans in KT centers, and Bonnie made a comment about granting agencies in Canada always require KT plans to be integrated and involved from beginning to end. And I just wanted to say that I think every KT center has developed a KT plan in association with what it is that they're doing. Mark was referring to the selection criteria for proposals, and that there's nothing that's been combined into one kind of criteria which relates to knowledge translation. So doesn't mean that we don't have integrated planning along the way. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Right.
We have another question that's come in for Shannon and for Mark. The question is, do you use the communications department at your university, and if so, in what ways? Mark?
This is Mark. We do not use the communications department at our university, and I'm not. That could be interpreted in a number of ways when you say communications department. So maybe you could clarify that for us. We obviously have a communications department where they teach students, but we also have a number of organizations that provide media services at the University of Washington, including services related to content and content development. Those at the University of Washington are services that require payment, and so we've built within our own team the capacity to develop materials and to do the computer and the web and if necessary video development. So that may be unique to the University of Washington, but we try to build capacity within our own teams for the KT Center work.
If I can chime in, the university at Buffalo has just recently ramped up their efforts to get all of its different entities. I guess they would just want to get us reeled in. I got messages on Facebook saying, "Are you the same person? Because we don't know who's doing what. There are so many entities out there." And they've run some workshops. I can really appreciate that they are working to provide us with more resources. I think in the future, sending them more press releases will be easier. I don't believe that we do send them any press as of now.
Okay. Let's see how we're doing on time. Not too bad. This is a question based upon, I think, some things that we've heard those working in media outlets talking about, and that involves consumer stories. So I guess the question is, to what extent and how may KT centers have helped facilitate the development of consumer stories, or what do you think would be helpful to grantees or others in developing consumer stories that the press would be interested in? Got any ideas, Kathleen?
Well, this isn't exactly, the main idea that comes to mind isn't a KT Center project, but John, is the work that the VR Autism did in developing case studies on individuals with autism and their experience with employment. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Well, we had a strategy in a past project we had here at CETL that Kathleen's referring to, which looked at programs that were identified as being on the front edge of success with persons with disabilities, and use that as an opportunity to focus in on what some of those folks were experiencing in their personal life and how they were benefited directly by the program, and use that from their own experiences. So I guess the question is if there are ways in which we KT centers could help in that kind of development process, or maybe provide examples or other kinds of things, so that those do seem to be important communication mechanisms that we want to try and help support grantees in understanding and maybe producing. And I think probably, Mark, y'all have done maybe a lot of work in that area. Is that correct?
John, I apologize. I'm trying to multitask and respond to a question in the chat, and my brain can't multitask that well. So can you?
Oh, Mark, yes.
So could you ask that again?
A question was around consumer stories and the extent to which KT centers may help support either the development or other grantees developing consumer stories, since they seem to be a key way that the media likes to communicate.
Yeah. You know, that's an area we're beginning to explore at the KT Center. We might be somewhat unique because the KT Center works with 10, many of you know, with 10 regional centers. The regional centers have quite a bit of expertise in developing public service announcements, in developing and releasing media items for the media and for publication in newspapers. But they tend to do that within the regional center, and we haven't, as of yet, provided a lot of support for them. Many of those regional centers have been in place for a long time, upwards of 20 years in some cases. But what we have been exploring more recently, and where we kind of see our role, is in being able to represent the work of the network rather than more specifically, you know, consumer stories that may be more relevant at the regional level. And so we have just recently started writing what we're calling success stories. They're stories that are based on successful interventions, technical assistance or training or public awareness activities that have been provided within the network that have resulted in a really positive outcome in relationship to implementation of the ADA. And we haven't, I mean, I'll be honest, we haven't really spent a lot of time thinking about how we're going to get those out beyond using our own resources, the website and other ways that we currently interact. But we have spent a good bit of time thinking about what those should look like. And we do have one up already. I think Jessica posted it, the link to it. But you know, really trying to think about it as being written kind of from a journalistic perspective to the extent possible, having people and quotes, and having it be very kind of active and engaging, but with the emphasis really being on what was the role of the regional center or the network, and what did they do that is potentially replicable that resulted in a greater implementation of the ADA, so that those success stories become exemplars for others to consider. That they're and they may not sort of replicate that success story, but they may see elements of it, of the activities that they might be able to replicate in their settings. I think we do need to spend more time thinking about how to get those stories out, and that's actually a big push that we're engaged in right now, is just how to represent the national network so that people understand it, excuse me, because it's a complex kind of thing, but they understand it and they also understand what its purpose is. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I like that terminology of success stories. It really draws people in. Shannon, anything along this line?
You know what, that doesn't really apply to us. Oh, sorry, I was on speaker again. Yeah, I don't think that really is relevant. That's not salient to kind of what I've been going for.
Okay. Bodies Inc. raised a question about, does anyone use RSS feeds?
I used to. A lot of the sites, I used to use Google Reader, and they disabled that tool, so I took that as a sign that RSS was on its way out, although it was working great when I was using it.
Okay. Anybody else?
We're not currently using RSS feeds in the ADA KT.
All right. There's another question. Does anyone use Google Alerts to access shareable content?
I've actually used that, how I mentioned I did some social media consulting before, and that was very handy. I haven't actually set it up, but I've got a notepad full of great ideas that I want to implement in my little slice of time that I'm devoting. Another thing I did want to touch on, I saw a question somewhere about international posting and if that has affected any way that I use social media. And I do have to say, yes, as soon as I took over the Siri Facebook page, I realized I had to change my notification settings on my phone because people doing their research in Asia were liking our page at what was 3 or 4 in the morning, and my phone was going off, letting me know that I had a notification. So I had to adjust that. Normally, Facebook is quiet at night.
All right, that sounds great. And I'm noticing that Jess Jakin at NARIC is saying she uses Google Alerts a lot and really appreciates them. All right, we've about reached that time where we're going to take a 10-minute break, so we will reconvene at 5 minutes after the hour. So please come back. We have 4 more centers to hear from, and they have exciting information to share. See you later.